This is the new quantum era. I'm your host, Sebastian Hassinger. Before we get into today's conversation, the episode is brought to you by OutShift, Cisco's incubation engine. The need for computational power is rapidly increasing in every sector, from drug discovery to material innovation to complex financial modeling. Classical systems are reaching their absolute limits. It's time for a paradigm shift. The answer is a scalable quantum network built on open standards and vendor-agnostic architecture. By uniting distributed quantum devices, you unlock limitless computational power. Learn more about the Cisco Universal Quantum Switch at outshift.com. For the 100th episode of the show, I didn't do the interviewing. Bob Karr, partner at Barnes Thornburg, co-chair of the firm's quantum technology industry group, and one of the architects of the Quantum Law Navigator, invited me to Chicago to sit in the other chair. We recorded this live in front of an audience at Barnes Thornburg, which sits at the center of what I'd argue is the most sophisticated quantum ecosystem in the world right now. Bob led the creation of the Quantum Law Navigator for the Chicago Quantum Exchange, and his firm is building a quantum practice at the intersection of law, policy, and the science that's reshaping both. He's the right person to ask the questions I usually ask. What Bob wanted to explore, and what I think makes this episode worth your time, is what perspective I've actually gained from sitting with nearly 100 physicists, engineers, founders, investors, and policymakers over the past several years. We talk about how the field has changed since I first walked into IBM's TJ Watson lab in 2017, what the Helgoland documentary taught me about the roots and the future of quantum mechanics, what I've learned from guests like Harley Johnson, Martin Laforêt, Alejandra Castillo, Nadia Mason, John Martinez, and John Preskel, and where the technology actually stands right now, fault tolerance, modalities, algorithms, and the systems engineering that's going to determine whether any of this becomes a real industry. This is a celebration of the work it's taken to build a foundation of understanding in this emerging field so that others can more easily find their way in, the way I had to find mine. We end with a look at what's next, including Build Quantum Partners, and the work we're doing to help quantum ecosystems and companies bridge the gap between science and sustainable industry. Thank you to Bob, to Barnes Thornburg, and to everyone who was in the room that night in Chicago. Thanks also to Kevin Roney, my co-host for the first couple of years of the show as we were getting our feet under us and figuring out what we wanted to do. I don't think this show would exist in this form without him. Here's episode 100.
First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to have a little bit of a conversation. Sebastian has really worked in incredible ways to tie a lot of the community together across the United States, including overseas. And I think it was last year at Q2B Tokyo is when we first met. But like most of the people that you meet in the community, you take notes and then you stay connected and then you also make connections for people. What we're going to talk about today includes his podcast, but also a book that was published last month. And what you're going to hear as we go through the stories, instead of just asking him how was it to write a book, I'm going to ask him to talk about what he learned from the interviews that he's had over the years, but also about the book and why he wrote it. But in summary, we have a book that's come out that's really prepared us to understand how we got here, not just how we got here, why we got here, who was instrumental in getting us here. And the podcast kind of overlaps the last chapter or so, which brings you up to March of this year. And starting a few years ago, these interviews are with people that are making history. It's not people who made history, it's people that are making history. So to have this resource so available, and I think it was because there wasn't a resource, and with your background, we'll learn about tonight, that you were able to, you know, to do this maybe initially for yourself, but ultimately has become a group project. I don't know if you want to say anything before we get started.
Oh, just thanks to Barnes and Thornburg and to you, Bob, for putting so much effort into hosting this. It's very. I didn't imagine anything quite so grand for the 100th episode, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So with that, the rest of the night we'll do this for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if there's things that we're talking about or things that we're not talking about that you want to go into, we can spend a few minutes doing that afterward, and then we'll have opportunity for more conversation, drink, and food. So no rush tonight, and really appreciate your patience with doing this. And again, thank you.
Thank you.
So I've got some, written remarks that I'll start with, and then somehow he'll edit this so that everything sounds perfect. But first of all, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for a special live audience recording of the 100th episode of the new Quantum Era. This is a milestone not only for the show, but also for the community of scientists, engineers, founders, investors, policymakers, students, and curious listeners who have followed quantum technology as it has moved from a highly specialized research frontier into a field with real engineering, commercial, policy, and societal stakes. Today, we are turning the microphone toward the person who has spent nearly 100 episodes asking the questions. Sebastian Hassinger has built the new quantum era around long-form conversations with the physicists, engineers, builders, and thinkers working at the edge of quantum computing, networking, sensing, algorithms, and theory. The show has earned a distinctive place in the quantum conversation because it tries to do something difficult, cut through the hype without losing wonder, make technical ideas accessible without flattening them, and follow the field in real time while answering the questions which are still emerging. For this 100th episode, we look backward and forward. We'll talk about what Sebastian has learned from the first 99 episodes, how the quantum ecosystem has changed, where the science and engineering stand today, how regional hubs and global competition are reshaping the field, and what the next era of quantum may demand for everyone. Not only researchers, companies, governments, investors, but really for everyone. Sebastian, congratulations on your 100th episode and on your new book, also named The New Quantum Era, released last month. Thank you for creating a forum where difficult ideas can be explored seriously, openly, and with curiosity. We're delighted to have you tonight here on your show. So, you've written this book that you wish had been there when you got started. You've given us this remarkable guide. You tell the story of not just what's occurred, but who's done it and how they've done it and so forth. Is remarkable that you've brought us to the present moment, but your podcast has been, now in the works and developing this story for several years, and there's plenty of places to start. And I think we want to jump in, perhaps what I think might be one of your most favorite places in history, and it's an island, and it's a time about 100 years ago,
Yeah.
and it's Helgoland. So maybe you can just start there.
Yeah, that's a great segue, actually. Thank you, Bob. That was a remarkable experience. So 100 years ago, 1925, Heisenberg was suffering from allergies. He went to the island of Helgoland in the North Sea off the coast of Germany, which was sort of famously a health retreat. Because there's very few trees. So
But Heisenberg's just a tourist?
No, well, yes, he was trying to get relief from his allergies so that he could work on this very hard problem.
He was also a physicist?
That Niels Bohr had assigned to him. Yes. So already a physicist and also one suffering from hay fever.
Yes.
He woke up in the middle of the night and had this insight essentially into solving the problem that Bohr had assigned him through matrix multiplication.
Yeah.
And it is really seen as the piece of the puzzle that brought all of the disparate threads in physics that weren't really making any sense together into quantum mechanics. And so, the discipline of quantum physics really traces its roots back to that instance. So in June of last year, Yale and Max Planck Institute had a conference. And initially, I'd been invited to record podcast episodes there,
Right.
as I'd done at other conferences. But I realized it was too historic an occasion not to capture. So we raised some money, and my wife and I actually produced a documentary. So we went there and shot for 5 days and got a ton of footage, which we were slowly and painfully working our way through. But it was a really, really amazing experience because there were 4 or 5 Nobel Prize winners there. There were people from theoretical physics, from experimental physics, from quantum technologies, from sort of the entrepreneurial side. Rob Scholkoff and the Yale gang were there, who sort of are the project, the originators of the transmon, the superconducting qubit. And it was just an incredibly rich experience of the distilling sort of everything that's going on in quantum right now,
Yeah.
in a really profound way. So,
Yeah. This being the 100th podcast, you have lots of listeners, and the numbers that you've shared with me are astounding. So that clearly you're being listened to, and a lot of people know who you are. But why don't we refresh everybody's recollection? Because you're going to talk tonight about things as though you were there in the room, and also perhaps as a scientist, but your background is not that.
no.
So
Yeah.
the materials you've developed help us non-scientists really understand. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about
Yeah,
yourself
sure.
and the projects
Thank
and
you.
how they came about?
So, my whole career has been in emerging technology. So from the very beginning of the internet, I was always drawn to the bleeding edge, whether that was the internet, the web, mobile, open source, big data, data science, machine learning, sort of that progression. And I happened to intersect with quantum computing. I went to a Think Summit at TJ Watson because I was asked to help with the open source strategy for Qiskit.
Sure.
And
So everybody knows TJ Watson, but why don't you explain?
Yes,
Because this is a very important place.
Yes, it is.
Not like you went to TJ Maxx.
No,
Okay.
no, different TJ.
Okay.
TJ Watson is the IBM research headquarters in Yorktown Heights in New York. It's a mid-century modern. It's Uranin who's the architect. It's a beautiful piece of work, and it's a very storied institution, and you can feel it. Actually, it's one of the last, if not the last, sort of golden era industrial R&D labs, which actually gave birth to a lot of classical technologies, random access memory, the hard drives. A lot of things were invented there.
So were you at Apple or IBM?
I was at IBM. Yeah.
So you get to go to this historic place. It's at the sort of the beginning of your journey, and some light bulbs start to go off at that time.
I mean, the thing that
we're talking roughly
2017. They were the occasion was to talk about the launch of the 53 qubit machine that was coming out in the following year. And
that in itself was a milestone. Why?
It was. Well, because before that, I think they had a 20 qubit machine, but superconducting qubits and for that matter, trapped ion qubits, the systems had been kind of stuck in the 5 to 10 range. So this was a big jump forward. And there was this sense of some kind of hurdle what had been passed, and that maybe there was a future with fault tolerant quantum computing at scale. I mean, what would that mean? And, Eddie Farhi was on stage, who was the originator, one of the QAOA, one of the variational algorithms. I think Alan Asper-Guzik was there. Certainly, Joshua was there. All of these famous names, and I could tell they were famous. I didn't know who they were at the time, but they were talking about all these foundational things, and it was just this laid bare kind of curiosity-driven foundational research into physics, into how the universe works, applied to something that I recognize as the very earliest stages of an emerging technology. And that was I was done, basically. There was no way I was
done
gonna
or just beginning.
That's done in my search for the next thing. This is going to be the emerging technology that I focus on for the rest of my
We
career.
are going to jump into the podcast in just a minute and bring it here to Chicago, where you've interviewed several key figures, one of whom is with us tonight. But just to put it in perspective, there's a 100-year anniversary last year, but this moment where things are starting to become identifiably real.
Yeah.
It was only 2017.
Yeah,
It's not even a decade
that's right.
ago. And a lot occurred, and it plays out in the book. It almost becomes a battle,
Yeah.
a little bit of and I don't want to say quantum supremacy because that
Yeah.
seems like a dirty word, but but companies competing to be recognized as at the forefront of
That's right.
this. And IBM, had in those who helped IBM along the way are 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 explained in your book as like an amazing individuals that have come together
Yeah.
to try to create something new. But this 2017, 2018, 2019 period is where it started to come together for you.
Yeah. I mean, well, it was my introduction, but
Yeah.
it also the industry, I think, hit an inflection
Yeah.
point. The major modalities had all been defined around the 2000s.
Yeah.
And then there was this really like a rut in terms of scaling in the 5 to 10 qubit range.
Yeah.
And there was a certain amount of despair, I think.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was
let's
going
focus
to
on that.
scale.
So there's a little bit of ping pong going
Yeah.
on between IBM and Google, for example. Just walk us through that in 2 seconds.
I mean, so there's there's a bunch of different races, and actually, if anything, the landscape is fragmenting more in terms of there's now 100 hardware companies. But at that point, there were sort of the earliest hardware companies, D-Wave, IBM, Google was investing. What IonQ and Rigetti essentially were that was what the crowd was, and it really was, I think there was a sense that whoever could pass that threshold of like, well, this is definitely a quantum computer that you can only do this one. This is provably an advantage
Yeah.
of any type. There would be some kind of brass ring or prize at that point.
Yeah.
But in fact, of course, because markets are much more complex than that, all it did was attract more attention and more investment
Yeah.
and more creativity and innovation. Like, because now there's, as I said, there's 100 hardware vendors, and there's now cross pollination of techniques and approaches to things like error correction from neutral atom qubits that are being applied in superconducting qubits. So there's this very rich kind of interaction going on at the foundational level.
Yeah.
I often make the parallel with classical computing, because we think about emerging technology as this incremental sort of rolling wave of innovation after innovation after innovation.
Sure.
But this isn't, the BlackBerry to the iPhone kind of, we've reset the clock to the late 40s, and we're somewhere before the invention of the transistor, actually. I mean, we've got a bunch of different versions of transistors, and we're not sure what the final sort of design is that's actually going to hit that scalability and commercial.
And I think as you end in the book, even, and the podcast will continue, there is no end. There's iterations and development and so forth. But okay, so we focused on qubits a little bit, quantum computers. That's not the only technology that's in play here when we talk about quantum technologies. You have sensors and also communication, networking, et cetera. And so maybe this is a good place to kind of we've focused on the science and qubits, but let's go to much more of a macro level, because I think people have gotten a sense that quantum is going to affect their life in some way, and in some cases, it's even their neighborhood. And if I kind of draw us into, and I'll start with episode 82, and if you can explain the individuals that I mentioned, their background, perhaps even anything about how that conversation came about. But let's begin with Harley Johnson here in Chicago. So Harley Johnson, who's the CEO of the Illinois Quantum and Microelectronics Park, the IQMP, makes quantum scale up feel very concrete, not just better qubits or better algorithms, but 120 acres. Now we're talking about real estate. A former steel mill. There's discussion about anchor tenants, names that we've mentioned already, and many others. Public-private governance, workforce planning, and neighborhoods asking how their grandchildren
Mhm.
might get quantum jobs.
Yeah.
So did that, meaning the interview, those interactions I know that continue with Harley, how do you think about what it means for quantum computing to move from science into industry and for things like this to be
Yeah.
happening and conversations like this to be happening?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, one of the first jobs that I had, a responsibility I had when I joined IBM Quantum formally in 2018 was to get IBM to join the Chicago Quantum Institute.
Yeah.
I didn't meet Harley in that way, but I did meet Kate and David Osham and other key figures in that organization, that sort of movement. I did meet Harley later when we were doing a partnership with UIUC. But yeah, I mean
So his journey started in the early 90s as
yeah,
far as I know,
yes, yeah,
and he's earned the role
oh
of
yeah,
CEO of IQMP.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and it's I mean he's
But maybe just focus on what did you learn from that?
yeah.
And
Well, one of the things is that he's an example of what it's going to take to create these bridges between deep scientific disciplines
yeah,
and engineering and technology and economic development, which is the practices that are required to build things in the real world.
yeah.
The physics community is very good at building abstract and
Mhm,
experimental things and not so much at production things that because that's not their job, right?
yeah,
But we need to be able to tap into these very esoteric advances and techniques and learnings and translate them into
mhm,
economic
mhm,
realities. And I think IQMP is, I say it all the time, I think it's the world leading example of building an ecosystem for
mhm,
quantum technologies.
yeah,
And a lot of that has to do with how early the community here was forming Chicago Quantum
yeah,
Exchange and, using the phrase sort of skating to where the puck was going to go. But
yeah.
it's back to my point about that era in the around 2018, 2019, there was this sense of like rush to a finish line, but in fact it was rush to the starting line for starting to make things real.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about quantum hubs need both patience and urgency, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about urgency some more in a moment. But in episode 79, you interviewed Martin LaForest. Tell us about Martin and Quebec and
Yeah.
how, and maybe compare, contrast
Yeah.
that with IQMP. But they both have
Very similar.
similar,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Quebec has been very forward looking as well. And University of Sherbrooke is sort of the anchor
Hmm.
academic institution there. And there's some really great, I mean, Canada has a lot of really great talent, but Quebec had the sort of public sector initiative and investment required to actually turn it into a tangible hub. So DistriQ is spelled with a Q, of course, is sort of their full life cycle incubation. They leverage, I mean, they had some serendipitous investment in the 70s in Bromont in a semiconductor fab, which they were able to leverage. So they had some physical plant that they could
Hmm.
adapt, which I think helped them a lot. And they also had a very healthy sort of attitude towards attracting foreign investments. They have Pascal and I think Quobly is there as well. So they have a couple of foreign companies that are doing R&D. And then also the government, when they launched it, it was 90% public sector funding, 10% private. And they said right from the outset, this needs to flip over 10 years to 90% private and 10% public, which I think is that's a great sort of benchmark to have for
Sure.
moving towards making sure you're moving it towards sustainability and real, economic, a flywheel effect, essentially.
Sure, sure. So 100 years to get to this point.
Mhm.
In the last decade or so, things have been moving pretty rapidly. We now have these locations around literally the world now. But one, this didn't just happen. So your work is really helping people understand, what's taken place to get us here, and the story, and why story is important.
Mm.
Perhaps is to also be able to foresee how things will happen in the future. There's fits and starts, but we're on a roll, so to speak. But what's occurred in the past and those challenges that people face are similar to the challenges, different challenges, but people have to work through them the same way they always have.
Yeah.
So there's this urgency now. People want things, they want to be in
Yeah.
quantum, but these two places that we just discussed, and there are many others, um, there's been a lot. It's work for
Yeah.
a long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just shift gears a little bit, but staying on this sort of macro theme. Alejandro Castillo. All right. So she's visiting with us tonight,
Mhm.
episode 75. She's looking at all of this with the understanding of everything we're discussing, but also offers to view it through a different lens.
Right.
And I mentioned about what role, what jobs are for my grandchildren.
Right.
What impact is this having on everyone? So so in your conversation with Alejandra, she pushed quantum out of the purely technical frame and into a much broader economic development frame.
Yeah.
Jobs, suppliers, housing, regional coalitions, national security, and whether communities get to participate in the upside.
Yeah.
So did that change how you think about what it means to build a quantum ecosystem?
Yeah, it did. I mean, certainly I had been thinking sort of along the lines of the supply chain. There's very, very specialized equipment that's required to build these sort of vertically integrated quantum computers. Those come from a variety of suppliers. There's significant innovation and scale up that's required. And those are more like small manufacturing firms rather
Mhm.
than, quantum or computing firms, right? They don't have to make a fully integrated computer top to bottom. They need to make components. And that's a much broader impact for a broader swath of society. And that actually, the most interesting thing for me was sort of, it originated sort of a thread that I've been increasingly thinking about, which is this: if you take the focus away from the spotlight's been on these vertically integrated products, right?
Right.
A quantum computer, a quantum network. If you zoom out, really what we're talking about is a whole new set of advanced manufacturing techniques.
Mhm.
It's the ability to design and manufacture and engineer at the quantum level.
Yeah.
Classical semiconductors are at the limit of what classically can be done.
Mhm.
Under 2 nanometers is the size of a feature on a TSMC chip. It's the smallest feature they can engineer. Below 2 nanometers, you're at the quantum scale anyway. So the whole way forward is through quantum engineering, quantum design, quantum manufacturing. And from that perspective, the lens is actually, it's a reindustrialization in the United States, potentially,
Yeah.
depending on how much investment we can actually marshal.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of people involved. And let's get to another example, in maybe a different way to look at this. So uh, most quantum scientists aren't born as quantum scientists, right? So if we kind of turn our attention to Nadia Mason at the University of Chicago, and I promise for everybody we'll get out of Chicago in a moment.
We're in Chicago. It
We're in
seems
Chicago,
appropriate.
but episode 77. So um, you know, her path clearly, gives us the understanding that you don't arrive fully formed as a quantum person.
Right.
So maybe, she challenges two common assumptions, or her story does. First, that the field is only for people who were quote unquote math people from the beginning. And second, that
Right.
quantum progress is mainly about isolated technical breakthroughs. So, what did Nadia's story teach you about the human and institutional side of building the next quantum era?
Yeah. Nadia's great. She's the dean of the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering, and was an elite gymnast in a former life, and considers herself sort of weak at math as well. So, but I mean, there's a few things. One is, as you say, there's room for all sorts of different paths into. I usually start my interviews by asking people, how did you get to where you are right now? Because even people who came up through, just a more traditional academic pathway often took some kind of circuitous route, or there was some kind of serendipity, or they were on one path and then they decided to change. So there isn't really as new as quantum is, there's certainly no defined career paths.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of creativity to sort of, find a way in, but there's almost any number of ways in. So there is one for anybody who's interested enough, right? If you're motivated by curiosity and wanting to make a difference. And then the other thing is, I really love Nadia's model of leadership as service. Essentially, she sees it as not again, sort of the
She said nobody works for the dean.
yeah, yeah.
So, but what did she mean by that?
Well, that it's really about making opportunities, and making sure that everyone who is drawn to the topic, who's drawn by curiosity, finds a way to connect and to contribute what they uniquely have to contribute, right? I mean, this we're at this super early stage. It's somewhat trite to say we don't know what we don't know, but that's literally true, right? I mean, for all of the imagining of use cases or the problem solving and engineering that we're applying to particularly in fault tolerance or error correction, or the moves into public markets, market listings, there's really no certainty about where we are or where we're going at all.
Yeah.
And I always use this example. So at the risk of repeating myself, because I think I've said it maybe 4 or 5 times on the podcast in the past, but the Monte Carlo algorithm was developed by Stan Ulam, who was working at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies under von Neumann, who had built a system which it was built for physics calculations.
And he didn't go to an island with hay fever.
No, it had nothing to do with quantum. Well, actually, it did sort of have something to do with quantum, because he devised it as a way to get neutron diffusion calculations out of this very limited machine at a larger scale than you could actually do by sampling, right? By doing the Monte Carlo thing. It wasn't until 30 years later that somebody looked at a financial portfolio and thought, I wonder if I could do something with this Monte Carlo algorithm. It was a technique that a scientist created to get something useful out of the machine.
So what did they do?
It was an act of creativity. What did they do? I mean, they created all kinds of stuff. Right? The Monte Carlo algorithm is one of the most powerful tools in financial analysis ever, right? It's portfolio analysis and optimization. When you say that, you mean Monte Carlo simulation.
Yeah. So one of the points you're making is the utility of something could be.
He was playing solitaire.
Yeah.
And the act of playing solitaire created the idea of a sampling technique on this very limited machine that would get him better physics calculations than he could do directly on a machine. And then, I would say a lack of creativity in the general community. I mean, made it take so long so if you had more creative minds looking at what he was doing at the time, that might have been a few years instead of decades. Right? So you need a lot of orthogonal thinking, outside the box thinking, creative minds. And that's back to Nadia. I think she creates an environment where there's kind of there's an idea that everybody can contribute. It's just a matter of finding your particular way in.
Yes. And in those moments, or those epiphanies happen on an island with hay fever. They have to be playing
ways.
in the most unexpected ways.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to pick up anywhere you like around John Martinez. So he's in your book for reasons, and maybe you can explain how he fits into all of this and continues to, but you have episodes 48, 67, and 71. You spent time with him. Beyond him, just the two of you finding good company. He's a player, and there's many examples. I picked him because he's straddling lots of different things, and he's woven himself into some of these huge milestones. And so tell us about John.
Yeah, I mean, I was very grateful that we had hit it off in the prior 2 interviews, because that allowed me, when he won the Nobel Prize, to call him up and say, "Hey, you want to come on the podcasting?" I was like, "Sure." It was a good get, as they say.
Right. But the Nobel Prize, I don't want you to.
No,
it's another important milestone.
That's what's really interesting. He really is at the very beginning of superconducting qubits. They weren't qubits at that point. It was Michel Devray and himself and John Clark were demonstrating macroscopic tunneling in Josephson junction, which is the basis of superconducting qubits. But this is in 86, I think, was when they published the paper, and that's what the Nobel was based on. He then, the next sort of major, I would say, sort of accomplishment is he built that system at Google that was 53 or 54 qubits that they carried out the experiment, which was random circuit sampling, with the claim that it would take millions of years to do classically. The claim was then challenged by IBM, which is a little bit.
So just put it in since we've talked about dates and we talked about this.
This is 2019.
2017, you're at IBM. A couple of years in all of these people come together because there's a technology that's developing in important ways. Google 2019, John's kind of at the heart of that.
Yeah.
Just we'll get back to John's story, but this is an important part because it really caused everybody's head to turn.
Yeah, it did.
So what was that moment?
Well, I mean, it was a claim that a quantum computer could do something that you couldn't do by any other means,
Yep.
which certainly, I mean, for all of this to be worthwhile, we have to get to that place, right?
Mhm.
If you can just simulate it even on a supercomputer, then why wouldn't you do that? Why
Yeah.
would you build a whole other industry to build a whole other mode of computation if it can't do something you can't do otherwise? So that was really the first overt claim that that system was able to do. It was a contrived task. It's random circuit sampling. So it's essentially creating random quantum circuits and then sampling those on the device. So it has classical overheads which make it harder to do classically. So
Mhm.
it's not a useful task, but it was at least the first public claim that this particular thing couldn't be done
Mhm.
in any kind of reasonable
Yeah.
time frame class.
And John's continued to do work.
Oh yeah, and that's what I was
creating
going to say is
useful,
that
yeah.
that was really one of the key sort of moments in this. In the book, I refer to as the heroic age of qubits. It's sort of like the genius PI or PIs, group of PIs, sort of declaring that they alone know how to build a qubit. Nobody else can do it as well as them, and they're going to get to that finish line, get to that sort of inflection point of like, there, we proved it. John is really interesting because he's made this really very dramatic sort of transition into. He is a systems thinker. That's what's
Right.
really interesting about him.
Yeah.
He at Colab, the startup that he's leading now, they're actually taking a consortium approach. So they have partnerships with Quantum Machines, which builds quantum control systems, with Applied Materials, with HPE, and with others to try to
Yeah.
create an open architecture.
So let's
to get
let's break that down for a minute,
Yeah.
because I think what I got out of it was you have a scientist who's willing to do something different than just be a scientist, be a
Yeah.
system builder, and realize that a lot of things have to come together for it to be true.
Yeah.
So that way of thinking, and perhaps John and the things that he's focusing on, could also be a lesson to people in the space
Yeah.
to collaborate and look at this as something more than just that perfect qubit.
Yeah.
To get that perfect qubit to work, you need
Yeah.
everything else to
Yeah.
come together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the path to quantum advantage, as we call it now, because supremacy does have terrible overtones. So as an industry, we decided we're going to call it advantage, is going to require, as I've called it before, a vertically integrated system that has qubits at its core, but there's a ton of other really specialized equipment, all that all has to work, sort of at the highest level of tolerances.
I'm going to get to some random questions on the technology in a minute. We'll do some rapid fire, but just to maybe finish up on some of the folks that you've spoken to. So on a recent podcast, you were asked, if you go to dinner with anybody, who would it be? So tell us who that is. But you also interviewed his student, John Preskill.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of combine that into a story
Yeah, so
for
that
us.
was Yuval. He asks all of his guests that question. We were interviewing each other because he launched a book, and we were sort of doing a crossover episode. And I said John Feynman because I was Richard Feynman, John Preskill, Richard Feynman, because he valued curiosity above everything else. He's sort of, maybe apocryphally. I don't think so. I think he actually did say, unless you can explain something, you don't really understand it. So my method with the podcast and with the book and everything, a lot of it is so that I can learn. I'm trying to get to the point where I can actually explain it credibly to somebody.
Feynman has buildings named after him.
Yeah.
He's considered alongside Einstein, right?
Yeah.
So just a few more words.
So he kind of made his name in the Manhattan Project. He was leading one of the calculation groups there, but then his Nobel was for quantum electrodynamic theory, which is a foundational piece of quantum mechanics. But most importantly, in the quantum technology realm, he was sort of the person that in 1981, MIT and IBM put on this small conference on the thermodynamics of computation, and they invited Feynman to sort of test their thinking about like, is quantum computing possible and is it worthwhile?
Yeah,
And his
that time frame was
1981, yeah. And his keynote at the end was, it's kind of semi extemporaneous, actually. I don't think he wrote it ahead of time. He's just sort of, he'd watched all the talks and he said, nature isn't classical, damn it. That's where that quote comes from. So if you want to simulate nature, you're going to need a quantum computer. And it seems like a really hard problem. So that probably means it's a good problem to solve.
A lot of people are chasing that problem.
Yeah.
And including his student. So why don't you tell us a little bit about John?
So John, he wasn't actually a student. He was a peer at Caltech. He joined Caltech, I think maybe first as a postdoc, but certainly as a associate professor, some sort of faculty when Feynman was still teaching. And in fact, John uses the Feynman's, amphitheater now for his teaching at his classroom, which is great, and still looks exactly as it does in the videos of Feynman's lectures. Preskel is really, he's fantastically bright. He also coined the term NISQ, near term, noisy intermediate scale quantum devices, which was a way of explaining why we should be making these devices when they aren't full-fledged computers. Like, is there value in them? That's he's sort of the go-to for like, how are we doing? Are we making progress? And are these things good for anything? And he posited that potentially there were NISQ applications. I mentioned variational techniques with Eddie Farhai is one of the originators, and Alan Asperger-Guzik with VQE and QAOA. Those are ways to use noisy qubits in a variational algorithm to arrive at some approximation faster than you could classically. Potentially, they haven't really panned out the way they'd hoped. But Preskel's broader point was, in any case, we'll learn so much about how to make these devices by making these devices that it's always worth it. It's worth it, even if I would think, I think John would say, even if we don't end up with, a Shor machine that can crack any code or whatever, we hit some kind of limit in scale. We're learning so much about the fundamentals of quantum physics and applying them to design and engineering techniques that it's almost analogous to the space mission in the 60s, where we learned, the CD and the laser and all kinds of other technologies came out of the challenge that we have.
But we may never get there, but the journey will be fun.
All right. The friends we make along the way.
So this is perfect time to stop and do a technical lightning round, because I don't think you've proven to everybody that you understand this, despite not being a physicist.
Not a physicist.
But the question I know everyone in this room is asking is, fault tolerance is often described as the central technical barrier between today's experimental quantum systems and truly useful quantum computers, right, everybody? Is that the right way to think about the field's current bottleneck, or does that framing oversimplify the challenge?
No, I don't think it oversimplifies it. There's a lot to unpack when you say fault tolerance.
I'll give you 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, it's better quality qubits. So it's better engineering and design and innovations in design and engineering.
Yeah.
And it's also approaches to error correction, and it's also approaches to system design. So there's probably 100 different really tough challenges embedded in the phrase fault.
So there's not going to be one person in a lab that figures this out on their own, nor is there one tool that you're going to bring to the room.
No, fault tolerance is an emergent quality, right? So it could be, if you're dealing with neutral atoms or trapped ions, you have inherently higher quality qubits. They're not as noisy, so you don't need as many of them and as much redundancy to get to error correction and fault tolerance. If you're talking about superconducting, you have a whole different set of attributes. So it's engineering the whole system to have the emergent property of fault tolerance.
So what you're talking about, Sebastian, you laid out very nicely in the book with charts and so forth. So there's lots of modalities. We get confused on which is which and what they're doing and which company's doing what. But you've laid that out nicely in a chart. But as you're suggesting, some of them are going to be really good at this and we'll have a little bit of trouble with that.
Right.
Ultimately, we don't talk about it in terms of winners and losers. There may be modalities that are better suited for certain things. We just don't know yet.
Yeah.
But as you were suggesting a few minutes ago, it's worth walking through the door and we're going to learn. But fault tolerance is an issue.
Yeah.
And its
100%.
solve is a little bit complex, as you're suggesting. But you were talking about the whole inferring a whole stack too.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to mention some of the things that, in integrated systems, there's qubits, controlled electronics, cryogenics, lasers, packaging, calibration, readout, software decoding, and so forth. Readout, let's start there. So all this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
You have to be able to.
Yeah. I mean, that's, in a way, we're on, if you look at all the roadmaps of the hardware vendors, we're in this early era of logical qubits, right? And logical qubits are just aggregations of physical qubits that are acting in a coordinated manner to have some level of error correction, which is a building block of fault tolerance, right? But the thing that's kind of hidden in that is that in order to get error correction that really works, you need to have a very, very tightly engineered classical quantum loop, because you actually need to do what they call mid-circuit measurements. And so in the middle of the computation, you need to read out some of the qubits. So now you have a classical measurement.
Right.
And then you have to do what they call syndrome detection, which is detecting whether there are errors that have emerged in the system. And then you have to correct those errors and feed forward into the the continuing class or quantum computation. You can imagine if you've got an algorithmic quantum advantage, you could very easily bleed that away through a slow readout, syndrome detection, syndrome correction, and feed forward circuit or a cycle. So that whole life cycle has to happen so fast that it doesn't erode that quantum advantage.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm watching the most closely right now, is how each of the hardware vendors are approaching that challenge, because that's kind of the make or break at the heart of error correction.
Yeah. I can see everybody sitting on the edge of their chairs wanting to ask this next question about algorithms. So are algorithms a bottleneck? Tell us about where they stand today, how they're useful, but let's start with what they are.
Yeah.
Who's working on them and why, and tie it to use cases.
Yeah. Well, an algorithm is a recipe for solving a problem, right? And we have algorithms in classical computing, things like bubble sorter, quick sorter, sort of the most easily recognizable. They're ways of sorting data in the most efficient way, depending on context. In quantum, we have a very small set of algorithms that we know of, Shor's being sort of the most famous, which factors a large number to its primes, which happens to be the reverse of how we secure data with modern cryptography systems. And there aren't a whole lot of others, right? There's Grover's and HHL and a couple of others, but I'm not concerned about that. And I actually used my example for why before, which is the Monte Carlo algorithm. That's an algorithm that was developed for a very particular use case that no one would have thought that had commercial value at the time. No one would have created the Monte Carlo simulation or algorithm before that computer existed. So when I say, one of the reasons I say we don't know is when we get machines that you can't simulate classically anymore, the physical scientists are going to start using those and developing techniques to use them to solve problems that they can't solve in other ways. And those will almost naturally lead to unintended other consequences or other uses, right? So I think that, this is sort of the urgency, but patience. That's the patience part of it. It's like we have to have the urgency to try to build these devices, but then the patience to discover what it is that they're actually really good at.
Yeah. Well, bringing the, technical round to a close, is there anything that we didn't discuss? I mean, there's a lot we didn't discuss, but is there anything that comes to mind that you'd like to put on the record?
Well, I mean, I think there's often sort of a horse race mentality about the modalities. I think that there's going to be a lot of money. It's not like, I don't foresee the kind of collapse that we saw in classical once, there was there were vacuum tubes and there was exotic ways to make transistors and a bunch of different approaches. And then the monolithic solution came along, and you'd print an integrated circuit, and it was obviously the best solution for scale and reliability. And we were off to the races. I don't think my gut feeling is that we're not going to hit that point where it's like, oh, that one.
Yeah.
I think they're going to coexist. They're going to potentially even be in the same systems. Things like with longer lived coherence times, like atom-based qubits, may be well suited for memory and not for rapid computation, for example. But I think they're going to coexist for a long time. So people are sort of concerned, like, which qubit do we invest in as an ecosystem or a fund or whatever? And it's like, actually, you should probably put a bunch of different bets down.
So that gets us to one of your most recent podcasts, episode 96. So in your conversation with Chris, is it Knotts?
Yeah.
And Zeynep Kodaturk of Fergan Ventures.
Yeah.
Excuse me all. The funding story shifts from, is there enough capital for quantum, to, is there the right kind of capital at the right stage? They argue that seed funding is no longer the main gap, but that Series A and B rounds are where quantum scale-ups need specialist investors who can underwrite engineering risk, modality risk, and long timelines. Did that interview change how you think of about the financing bottleneck in quantum? And you were just talking about creating the perfect segue. What that it isn't a bet on one.
Right.
It's across the board.
Yeah.
And that we're getting to a point where investors really do have scientists working for them, or they themselves, and in this case, both of them, extraordinary backgrounds in the space so that they can really see it.
Yeah.
And so tell us about what they're doing and what the recommendations are.
Yeah, Fergan's really interesting. They're relatively new. They've only taken a few investments. Quantum Motion, the spin qubits, and Photonic, I believe, as well. And they met as angel investors in Cambridge Quantum, which is one half of what became Quantinuum. So they had a really good week last week. So, interestingly enough, I think they're right that the seed stage funding problem is largely solved, but I think that's actually a testament to efforts like CQE and IQMP. The public sector is largely validating the risk, right?
Yeah.
There's so much effort being put into technology transfer and things like duality here in Chicago. Creative Destruction Lab has a whole quantum cohort. That's a vote of confidence that there's a there for investors. But there is, I heard the market described as a barbell shape at Q2B in Paris last year, actually.
And they mentioned it too.
Yeah. And being that there are some very well capitalized companies, a very small number of them, either they're corporate, corporate divisions like IBM or Google, or they've done mega rounds like PsiQuantum through private funding, or they've got to public markets through a side door, through a SPAC, or now we have an old-fashioned IPO in Quantinuum. But there's a handful of them, and then there's this sort of giant valley of death. And I think they're right. It's in order to have the confidence to do a bigger check in an A or a B, you have to have a lot more domain expertise, because this is not, as I said, it's not just another emerging technology. This is a totally different ball game.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to evaluate the claims, the scientific claims, the validity of the approach, the team, and have the patience and the timeline that it's going to require, and the understanding of the error bars on exactly what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy to see the emergence of that specialty kind of fund. There are others that are in the works as well. And I think that's a really healthy sign of evolution, again, beyond the public sector investment and focus nationally and regionally in the United States and other countries to sort of the next stage of evolution to turn it into a viable venture market.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for the book, the hard work, and really on behalf of everybody, and for anyone who's looking to dive in to understand all of this, the book's a great read.
Thank you.
It reads really well. There are stories, so it's almost like a novel on how we got to where we're at. But I think it certainly made me feel more comfortable
Mm.
about the things I didn't know, and explained that, in fact, the things that we're encountering today and listening, about where we're at and the IPOs and so forth, just understanding how we got here
Right.
made me a lot more comfortable that we probably understand it better than that, but it's certainly confirmatory and a read that almost enjoy it, go through it, but it also can become a reference tool
Mm.
for understanding a lot more. Then the podcasts, we've laid out a few that at least I've felt are useful for people to get an understanding of what you're doing here. But there are 99 now, 100, if we didn't screw this up too bad.
Yeah.
Um, that people can find topics, and you've done a great job on your website, the new Quantum Era, to put all that information there. So before you even listen
Right.
to it, you have a sense of what's there, and pick and choose. So that's great. That kind of gets me to the final, place in our discussion, which is what are you going to do next?
Mhm.
And I know it's not there's just a next, but you have a lot to offer, and I think you're identifying some opportunities where you could be useful beyond just providing information, the knowledge, the experience, the people. But what does this all mean to you now? Where do you go?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of irons in the fire. The thing that I'm the most excited about is really going back to uh, we've touched on regional ecosystems and this sort of evolving set of more mature
Mhm.
companies. There's a demand for quantum hardware R&D space, which IQMP is and other regions are doing a good job of starting to fill. But ultimately, that needs to lead to, as I said with Quebec, it needs to lead to a self-sustaining private market, right,
Mhm.
or private capital infused market. So what I've started with some partners. We call the entity Build Quantum Partners, is to try to engage with the ecosystems and with the sources of demand, the tenant pool, and find ways that we can sort of take the friction out of that, out of the whole set of challenges, right? So if it's could be a European or an Asian company that needs entry into the U.S. market, that's a whole complicated set of challenges in and of itself. So we're trying to set up a way to help them do that, and among including choosing where they're going to hone their R&D efforts. It could be Illinois, it could be multiple sites, right? Depending on what they're actually trying to build, and then from the public sector side, be a partner in managing that influx of demand, finding the right fit, potentially building facilities for an anchor tenant. Ultimately, the goal is to get to the point where when there is enough of a sustainable market, we think that the biotech hub model is really there needs to be a quantum version of that where there's R&D facilities with a larger anchor tenant and some amount of footprint that's reserved for the earlier stage,
Mhm.
more risky exploratory kind of venture backed or seed backed startups. So that's what we're experimenting with. It's going to be there isn't a clear path. It's going to be very experimental. It has to
Sure.
be sort of tailored to each player in that whole space needs somewhat of a custom approach. But that's the kind of challenge I like. So
Yeah, great. Well, we look forward to seeing all of that. Well, this is your show in many ways, and you do your sign off at the end of every show. But I want to just close us out. I want to thank you for sharing your stories and doing all the hard work that you're doing. But you have an audience out there. What would you like to say in your 100th episode?
Oh, I mean, I appreciate the audience so much. I get a lot of feedback on, the what's valuable, what kinds of things. I love suggestions for themes for shows or
Mm.
guests that I should have on. And I'm trying to with the website now. I'm trying to create more of a space for interaction. So, I'd say like if you want to see something on the show, let me know.
All right.
I'm all ears. I
I'm
read
sure you'll
everything.
have some takers.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, audience, for joining us tonight, and thank you again, Sebastian, for
Thank
all of
you.
your work. You've really made a dent in this in a good way,
I hope so. Thank
and
you very much.
let's keep knocking it around, and I'm sure we'll get to that perfect qubit at some point. So why don't we give Sebastian a round of applause? Thank you. Okay, maybe we all did our job tonight. Good. Thank you for listening patiently through the discussion. Um, I'd like to open it up to see
Sure.
if anybody has any
Yeah.
questions. And while we've been recording this, the idea is your questions won't be live, but I think you might do a summary of the discussion afterward that the audience had, highlighting some of the points of interest
Yeah,
and so forth.
exactly.
So I'm going to just help with some mics, but does anybody have a question or a comment? Yeah, here we go.
I think
Yeah.
I can project. No?
Okay. Yeah, it's good.
All right. Well, my name is Jacques Philoctet. I'm with JP Morgan Private Bank. Wanted to thank you and Bob and the whole team for having us today. This was incredibly insightful. Um, what I did want to touch on, you do an excellent job on your book in terms of discerning between genuine progress of quantum versus the hype, especially when it comes to the transformative technological applications that quantum will bring to infrastructure and the value that we will derive from that with applications. If you think past it, as you think about the next 10 years, what is one signal that you think CEOs, investors, business owners are ignoring that will ultimately distinguish the quantum companies that create lasting values from the ones that disappear?
Yeah, tough question. Dana Anderson of Inflection, I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and he said, in the future, in the near future, any company that's not operating at the quantum limits for their industry won't be competitive. And I was struck at the time by how broad a statement that was. But it's one of the things I sort of have taken on board to understand the breadth of the potential impact here. So, when I talked about, the potential for economic development, I think that we have to be really, and, for example, if we get to a quantum computer by 2030 that you can't simulate classically anymore, you have to watch what people do with that machine really carefully, because it's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be portfolio optimization or logistics or any kind of optimization, because it's not large enough. It's not even going to be, pharma drug discovery. It may be something in material science that changes the economics of an input into automotive manufacturing, right? I mean, it could be very difficult to see the direct line from the innovation to the impact. And so that's, I think, what we need to do. We had to adopt a very I wrote a blog post a few weeks ago called Beginner's Mind, where I think that's what we have to adopt, is a very open kind of mentality to what is this that we're building, and what are we doing with it? What might the impact be? Because it's not going to be, if we wait around for the things that are obvious, like optimization or drug discovery or whatever, it's going to be, the innovations that happen along the way are going to be adopted by your competitors, and you're not going to be competitive. So it's a very creative problem to solve. Unfortunately, I'm sorry I don't have an answer. Really,
No one does.
no, I know. Anybody who says they do is in that hype category.
Thank you.
Hi, Alejandro.
Hi there. Thank you for incorporating economic development into the narrative. I'm fascinated by climate and what quantum can do for how we not only look at climate change or climate impact, but also what we do with regards to natural disasters,
Mm.
how people look at that. Has that come across in your many podcasts? Is that a conversation that people are having? There's nothing more challenging than to look at the
Yeah.
multitude of factors that come into, climate.
Yeah.
I will say the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, um, that would be such a way to lean in
Yeah.
how we're looking at climate and climate disaster.
I mean, it's challenging because this is a good example of sort of the obvious direct line, and the non-obvious sort of oblique line for innovation. So the work that I've seen around climate is really, it's the class of optimization problems, right? Because if you look at numerical weather prediction, which by the way was also pioneered at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Studies with von Neumann. It's amazing how many things started in that little tiny place and slice of time. It's a number crunching challenge, right? And it's a combinatorial challenge, and it's likely, well, it's not a sure thing, but it's possible that quantum computing is going to help with that type of problem, but it's a way down the road because those are very large. The whole uh, problem set that distinguishes what quantum is going to be useful for first is very small data with very high dimensionality, which is not how climate behaves, right? However, I do think there's a lot of, I sort of drew an example at the top of my head of like an input into an automotive manufacturer. Potentially there's all kinds of material innovations that might help with, I mean, like the research in battery technology, for example, there's a theoretical quantum battery it emits more energy than you've put into it. Like, it's bizarre, right? I mean, it doesn't quite, but that's what it seems like on paper. But it's these sort of really innovative potential material approaches that I think those are most likely the first impacts. And again, it takes orthogonal thinking and very creative application of thinking, because it's not just tackling, whatever aid distribution as a combinatorial optimization problem, which is going to need a larger quantum computer than we're going to have in the near future.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Again, thank you for this. This has been great. I'm sort of curious. We talked about bottlenecks a little bit. You're talking about the sort of way ancillary things will spin off before the direct lines. I'm thinking about it from a workforce perspective. And CQE has done a great job forefronting workforce and saying, really, we just want you to care about math. From a global perspective, or a more global perspective, systems thinking, where should higher education, K through 12, be thinking about putting resources to help us make sure we have a workforce, not just to design quantum computers, but to use them, to think more creatively so that we can get the biggest results from this revolution?
You are.
Sorry, I'm Rich McCarthy. I'm the Vice President for Research at Northern Illinois University.
Cool. Thanks for coming. It's a really good question. I think there's a couple of things that sort of feel to me like bottlenecks, educational bottlenecks, that are good approaches to educational bottlenecks. For one thing, that there's UCLA has a Masters of Quantum Engineering, I think is what they call it, program, where each semester is spent in a photonics lab, superconducting lab, a trapped ion lab, and they're developing master's level skills. I think that's a really good place to focus, because if any of these modalities hit some kind of inflection point of commercial value, the supply chain is going to, fall apart, basically. I mean, there's no scale built into the way we're building these devices. And to test and characterize and set up dill fridges, for example, that's a master's level skill set. It's not a PhD necessarily, right? So there's that, and then the supply chain itself. And the thing that, again, the sort of more diffused kind of approach to it is to take a step back. I talked to Quantum Brilliance sometime in November, I think. They're an Australian startup. They're doing nitrogen vacancy qubits in diamond, right? And they were telling me they have a viable commercial demand for their NV Center devices, not as qubits, but as sensing devices. So this is an industrial application of a quantum component. It's a quantum technology. It's just not a universal quantum computer. But there again, I think there's specialized skill that's not at the PhD level that's required to potentially, integrate that into a product design, or install them in a a building or an industrial deployment, right? I mean, I think there's a much broader set of skills that are not PhD in math and physics that are required.
Sure.
Hiya, I'm Chloe Washba. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago. Nadia Mason is my dean,
Nice.
and David Alshalom is my advisor.
Excellent.
So I saw PhD on your, and it's like, oh yeah, another scientist here. I'm particularly interested in the recent announcement by the federal government that they would take an equity stake in a couple different variety of companies, right? Some of them are semiconductor foundries and ranging to like Inflection and DistriQ, I believe, and other quantum startups. And then based on your most recent conversation with the Fergon venture capital fund, they said we need the right capital at the right time.
Right.
In your opinion, is this equity stake by the government the right capital at the right time?
Yeah, I mean, jury's out. It's hard to see it as okay. The parallels I would draw that I immediately sort of think is when there's a strategic investor, whatever GE invests in an equipment manufacturer or a network company or whatever, a startup of some type, the market interprets that as being that strategic investor is going to buy this company. So there's a signal being sent by who you have on your cap table. And I'm not sure how the market is going to interpret having the US government on your cap table. I mean, I can see the argument when we get to the point where there is viable dual use technology that you need defense contractors that are, we know what those types of companies look like, right? And that they have a profile that is optimized to serving the needs of the defense needs of the federal government. That's not what these companies are primarily. Maybe they'll be dual use, but they aren't right now. I mean, they're science experiments. So I really don't know how the market is going to interpret. I think there's the other thing that immediately calls to mind is you're exposing your company to the risk, to political risk, right? I mean, when the administration changes over, what is the new administration's attitude towards those investments? And if I'm an entrepreneur, I don't want to worry about somebody on my cap table suddenly having an antagonistic, approach to that stake. So I think there's a lot of risk, but they're unknown risks at this point because it doesn't really have a modern precedent anyway, and certainly not in this country. So another non-answer, but hopefully that was helpful.
Interesting to hear your perspective.
Thanks for a great talk about the quantum ecosystem. What do you think, in terms of your knowledge so far, is going to be the best candidate for a fault-tolerant quantum computer? Would that be?
That answer has a bunch of different, or that question has a bunch of different answers. I think in the short term, I'm very bullish about neutral atoms in particular, right? I mean, they have the advantage of, as I said, atom-based qubits are more stable. So both trapped ion and neutral atoms they have much higher fidelities. You need fewer of them to get to a logical qubit, so you don't have to have as large a scale. I interviewed Vlad and Vuletic after they had done the 48 logical qubit demonstration a couple of years ago. And it struck me that he was describing building a version of a von Neumann machine in the vacuum chamber because they can move the atoms around anywhere they want. So it's fully plastic in its topology, right? Whereas you fabricate a chip and you're stuck with how that chip is laid out. So there's a lot more power in prototyping. They're not nailed down. They don't have to wait through, like IBM is now pivoting entirely their chip architecture to implement QLDPC, and it's now a biplanar chip, and they need a lattice chip as well. So they're actually designing, two entirely new architectures just to try out a new error correction scheme. That's a big bet, and it's a long lead time. Misha and Vladan can just like whip up a new approach to error correction, pretty much overnight with their neutral atom array, and same with inflection and Pascal. So I'm very bullish on neutral atoms in the short term, but their main challenge is the wall clock time, right? I mean, atoms are just really slow to operate on, orders of magnitude slower than superconducting or spin qubits. So I go through this at the end of the book. I say, I know everybody wants to know which modality is going to win. So my answer is, I think near term, we're probably going to see neutral atoms because they have fewer scale problems than trapped ions. I think trapped ions have some viable ways to get to the necessary scale, but my guess is that neutral atoms will get to that 1500 sort of neutral atom array, and we'll get something that is absolutely impossible to simulate classically, which to me is that's the moment where we go like, okay, the quantum era has arrived, right? If you can, anything you do on that machine that's fully entangled, all the qubits are entangled and it's in superposition, good luck simulating that. You just can't. So anything you do on it is an advantage, even if it's not useful. But then I think superconducting and potentially spin qubits will overtake the atom-based ones. And photonics are kind of a dark horse for me. I'm not sure. But I think ultimately, long-term, the millions of qubit scale, is going to be won by either spin or photonic, because they're on the face of it, they're just so much more scalable once they overcome the scientific and engineering challenges that they face today. So it's a multi-phase kind of thing. That's why I'm saying I think we're going to have a plurality of modalities for a long time.
Seeing Microsoft pursuing topological quantum computing, what do you see in that in terms of a good a candidate for it?
Jury is still out. I mean, I theoretically, obviously, the promise of topological qubits is great, right? I mean, it's essentially doing, topological approaches to error correction are some of the most successful. So if you have a physical embodiment of a topological system, that should be, really well suited to fault tolerance. I think the jury's still out as to whether they've actually identified real Majorana fermions in that device. I mean, certainly the people I talk to, I trust, go like, maybe. They're using machine learning to filter and essentially cherry pick the results in real time. And unless they, are very transparent about that machine learning algorithm, I don't know that we can really trust that those are Majoranas. So it's a really fascinating topic because it's a whole bunch of really interesting challenges there. So I want them to succeed. I just don't know if the evidence is very strong right now.
Well, thank you. I think that's our last question. You know how to contact Sebastian. Thank you very much for all the time you put coming here and sharing everything with everyone.
I really appreciate it.
We look forward to hearing the podcast.
This episode has been brought to you by Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine. The need for computational power is rapidly increasing in every sector. From drug discovery to material innovation to complex financial modeling, classical systems are reaching their absolute limits. It's time for a paradigm shift. The answer is a scalable quantum network built on open standards and vendor-agnostic architecture. By uniting distributed quantum devices, you unlock limitless computational power. Learn more about the Cisco Universal Quantum Switch at outshift.com. That was our 100th episode, recorded live at Barnes Thornburg in Chicago, with Bob Karr asking the questions. I'm grateful to Bob for the invitation and for the way he structured that conversation. It gave me a chance to step back and think about what the show has actually been building, which is harder to see from inside any single episode. One of the things that stayed with me is something that came up in the audience questions, this idea of the beginner's mind. I wrote a blog post about this a couple of months ago. I think the most important applications of quantum computing probably haven't been imagined yet. The same way nobody imagined portfolio optimization when Stanislaw Ulam was playing solitaire at Los Alamos. That's what makes this field so exciting and so hard to narrate in real time. You have to maintain the urgency to build the machines and the patience to discover what they're really for. I think that tension is at the heart of the next 100 episodes. If you want to go deeper into the guests and episodes we discussed, Harley Johnson on the IQMP, Martin Laforêt on Quebec, Alejandra Castillo on economic development, Nadia Mason on leadership, John Martinez on the arc from Joseph's Junctions to CoLab, the Fergun team on the funding gap. You'll find links to all of them in the show notes at newquantumera.com. My book, also called The New Quantum Era, is available now wherever books are sold. If you've been listening since the beginning, or if this is your first episode, thank you. This show exists because of its audience, and I mean that. If you want to see something on the show, let me know. I'm all ears. Thanks for listening. I'm Sebastian Hassinger, and this has been The New Quantum Era. Theme music by OCH. See you next time.